nearly inspired.
It doesn't say flesh, it says sinful human nature. So we call it
I've heard
sinful
negative
human
things,
nature.
but I've never.
It's for a close study, it's not as good.
But for readability.
For readability, yeah, it's more of a dynamic equivalent. But we can get into. You don't want to become schismatic over Bible versions, right?
That's happened.
Yes, that certainly happened. Well, welcome everyone. Tonight we are in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23. Little preview of where we're going. Next week, if you're interested in biblical prophecy and end times and Jerusalem, Israel, the rapture, tribulation, all of that is coming into play. And we're going to spend 2 weeks on Matthew 24. The first week is going to be focused on the first century events, and the second week is going to be projecting to the end of the age, because they're both implied there. And there's more that I didn't even mention, the false teaching, false Christ. There's a great deal to take out of that. So that's coming up. So today, Matthew 23, I'm about to read it, but there's a paradox here. When you start talking about people who are self-righteous, what can happen? You can become self-righteous yourself. You're saying, those Pharisees, man, they deserved everything that Jesus said against them. And guess what you're sounding like?
A Pharisee.
So this is why I would just encourage us all to be attentive, aware of our own heart. Really, that's where we need to begin, with the Lord searching us. The prayer of Psalm 139 at the end, search me, O God, know my heart, try me, know my anxious thoughts, see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. But let's start with, I'll just read the text of Matthew 23, beginning at the start of the chapter. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. And they tie up heavy loads and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. And they love the places of honor at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called by men Rabbi. But do not be called Rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. And whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from men. For you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, even while for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you shall receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel about on land and sea to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the offering upon it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? And therefore he who swears both by the altar and by everything on it. And he who swears by the temple swears both by the temple and him who dwells within it. And he who swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier measures or weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. Consequently, you bear witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how can you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things shall come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you shall not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. What a chapter. Remember chapter 11, come to me who are weary and heavy laden. Jesus' tender heart toward those in need and everything. And we see another side of the same Savior. We see this fierce and fiery language. And, you know, strange as it sounds, I believe this, if Jesus simply hated those to whom he was speaking, the scribes and Pharisees, he would have said nothing to them. He would have ignored them. You know, they say that the opposite of love is not hatred, but indifference, and I think that would apply in this case. So he speaks, this is a final warning, as you see by the end verse here. This is the last chance, and I think that sort of fierce and fiery love, we can think of human situations, the mother of a drug-addicted son who's overdosed again and again, and he's about to head out onto the street, and his mother is suspecting that she may never see him alive again. How is she going to speak to him at that moment? Her love will move her to speak in a fierce way. And so I think that we have to grapple with the fact that this is a part of the overall picture with Jesus. Now, what we've been seeing happening in these chapters in Matthew is that the hope of any kind of rapprochement, a coming together, mutual understanding between Jesus and the religious leaders, that's slowly diminishing from the time of the triumphal entry up to this point. And so there's poignancy and there's tragedy that this outcome did not have to be this way. At the end of the chapter that we looked at before, we find in Matthew 22:46 says, no one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day on to ask him another question. Why did the conversation break off? Because Jesus asked them a question that they couldn't answer, and that was threatening to them. with their agenda of maintaining their position, their prestige, their role. It made them look bad. That Jesus had pulled out a verse that they had encountered before, but had no idea of the implications of. So it is these leaders who broke off this relationship. And now, if you really want to understand this chapter, I think the key verses in many ways are 25 to 28. And that's why I gave this a chapter title, Outwardly Righteous Yet Inwardly Wicked. Notice the contrast in these verses between the outward and the inward. Woe to you, he says, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. He said, you blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the dish so the outside may become clean also. And then he uses a very vivid image. You're like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside they're full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Why was that so offensive? Because the bones of a dead person were seen as ceremonially defiling to someone who would touch them, to touch a corpse, to touch the bones. So he's turning their own concept of purity and defilement and presenting it against, said that although they thought of themselves as sources of purity, they were filled with purity and they were spreading purity to everyone around them, and they were on a mission to get all the Jewish people to be as faithful, as observant and following the Torah as they were. And Jesus completely reversed it, said, no, said, you're a disseminator of uncleanness, ceremonial defilement. It was very, very incredibly offensive, of course, in that context. He said, you two outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you're full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. The critique here is going deep to the inside. It's really a critique from the inside out. And if what Jesus says is true about outwardly appearing righteous, these words that Jesus has spoken would have been a total revelation to those people who had been following the Pharisees' teaching. It would have been a revelation, because if they outwardly appeared righteous, how would they have known what was really within? Maybe they saw inconsistencies, and Jesus points out some of the inconsistencies and contradictions within the teaching. And notice that at the beginning, this is spoken before the disciples of Jesus and the multitudes. So it's spoken, in a sense, to the scribes and Pharisees, to the Jewish leaders, but it is an instruction for the whole people. And let me ask you this question. Think about this. What is Jesus trying to accomplish? What's his purpose in speaking in this way? You want to use the mic?
I'm sorry. I think there are a couple of things. Am I coming through? I think a couple of things. He's focusing the attention on the leadership, first of all, and how the leadership is gone wrong. So he's trying to get the crowds who are listening to understand that we shouldn't follow these leaders. He says it over here with not to call anyone rabbi, that we're all brothers. He says it in 23:7. But you are not to be called rabbi. You have one teacher, and you are all brothers, and do not call anyone on earth father, for you have but one Father. And the Pharisees are sort of who they look up to right now. And so it's sort of an idolatry situation, I think, where if you're following them, you're following this wrong practice.
So in short, he's trying to he's sending a message to the multitudes, primarily, not the Pharisees. He's not expecting them to.
I think he's trying to change they're already lost, I think. They've already given up on the message. I think he's trying to change the focus of the people.
Mm-hmm.
To focus their.
Does everyone else agree with that? Do you think he's primarily trying to? Is he hoping for a last 11th hour change of heart on the part of the Pharisee? Okay, Andrew says yes. It's possible. Okay, I saw Katie, and then Jeff.
Okay.
This is supposition.
Yeah.
This is supposition on our part, but it shapes how we would read the chapter.
Well, now it's making me think different. I guess I was just thinking that these are the people who are following the law so well.
Mm-hmm.
His teaching has always been to point to the heart And so I think it's one last attempt to say, no, this is about your heart, not just about what you're doing.
It is the last attempt. Notice that he says, "You will not see me again until the very end." So I think this is the end of his public ministry. My interpretation is that all of that discourse, Matthew 25, is probably spoken to the disciples. Matthew 24, Matthew 25, the teaching of sheep and the goats, the rest that's there, the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, that may have been to the disciples as well. And then after that, we have the upper room, the Last Supper. John, in his marvelous way in John's gospel, gives the whole upper room discourse in John chapter 14 to 17. And so but that's a private thing. So this is a culmination of his public ministry. So does Jesus say don't follow them? Don't follow. Does he tell the people not to follow the Pharisees? Ah. Oh, we can't hear you, Jerry. We can't hear you. If you want to repeat that?
So he's saying to follow the law because the law is correct, and he didn't come to change a word from the prophets. So he's saying follow that, but just don't follow their example.
This is a very interesting, the idea that, and I'm going to need to define some terms. It seems like a little bit of a digression, but there's huge controversy among Jewish and Christian scholars and readers of this chapter about anti-Semitism, about anti-Judaism, and then we could also talk for while we're at it about anti-Zionism. And they're not quite the same thing, so I'm going to define these in a minute. But if anti-Judaism is opposition to the Judaic rabbinical teaching, religious teaching, then was Jesus anti-Judaic? Well, yes and no, because he clearly is identifying things where he is calling out the Pharisees, saying that they are wrong. They're simply wrong. But if they were completely wrong, why would he say, verse 3, therefore, notice how unqualified this statement is, all that they tell you, do and observe. That's a sweeping statement. If the Pharisees had been saying, go and worship the Roman and Greek and Roman gods, you can't imagine Jesus would ever say that. So he can't simply be setting that aside entirely. But notice what he does say, do not do according to their deeds. Don't imitate them. Do follow. So Jesus seems to imply that if his hearers, if they follow the legal teachings, the rulings of the Pharisees, they're going to be okay, but they are in spiritual peril if they begin to think and act like the Pharisees. It's a kind of a subtle message because it's that they weren't wrong on all the legal teachings, otherwise Jesus wouldn't have said that, but there's something deeply, deeply wrong in the whole attitude of their life.
He even says in verse 4, what they teach, they don't even do.
Yes, which is a definition of hypocrisy, right? To say, do as I say, not as I do. Yeah. Hippocrates in Greek meant a play actor. It was someone who played a role. And the thing is, if someone plays a role long enough, like you ever watched the television shows about con artists, that pretend to be wealthy people in order to, take advantage of other people. Sometimes they call that sincere lying. They've been playing a certain role such a long time that they actually forget that they're lying, or they start to believe their own lies. And that's the problem of the Pharisee is a problem often of self-deception. They didn't really have an accurate picture of themselves, and it's a very, very. We'll talk about self-deception and spiritual pride later on, and how that appears in the Christian world. But it's something that's everyone around becomes aware of it, but the spiritually proud person may be very, very deceived about the nature of their own character, their own heart. They may presume to walking in the room, I'm the most spiritual person in here, and they don't see themselves as in the way that they truly are before the Lord. And they can fool. a lot of other persons. As one preacher said, he said, if a man walks into a church service on Sunday morning drunk on alcohol, he'll immediately get called out and maybe people sit down with him and counsel him and and maybe get him into a 12-step program or get him some kind of help. If he walks in drunk with spiritual pride, he may be promoted, become a member, and soon after that become an usher or deacon. So spiritual pride can go undetected. And what is the criticism? Why is that? Well, okay. Well, let's continue on. I don't want to jump too far ahead. So let me just say a little bit. I don't want to turn this into a huge tangent, but anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, anti-Zionism. There are critics of the New Testament, scholars who some of the critics don't believe that Jesus actually said this. They said, no, the church, later the Jewish believers in Jesus were in conflict with the Jews who didn't follow Jesus, and then they projected this language, put it back on Jesus' lips. There's no real basis other than supposition for making a claim like that. Of course, that's a denial that the New Testament is an accurate record of Jesus. There are others who say that New Testament is the Gospels are anti-Semitic. They reflect hatred or bias or rejection of the Jewish people. Now that's a little rich in a way, isn't it? Because, well, Jesus is Jewish, so if Jesus were anti-Semitic, then he would be against his own Jewish identity, and that would be a form of self-hatred. I'm not denying that can exist. There can be self-hating persons, including self-hating Jews, but I don't think that's what's going on. Anti-Semitism, then, just straightforward, is hostility or prejudice against Jewish people. Anti-Judaism is a little bit more tricky because that means opposition or critique of a religious system of Judaism. And then anti-Zionism, that's different. That relates to if Zionism is a political movement that supports the creation, maintenance of a Jewish homeland in Israel, then an anti-Zionist is someone who opposes that. Now, you can be anti-Judaic, but not anti-Semitic. And one case would be secular Jews. For example, people you've heard of like Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. They did not speak in a positive way of rabbinical Judaism, had no truck for it, no interest in it. They did not. That doesn't mean they rejected their Jewishness. There are also different interpretations of the law. There's some very liberal or modernist Jews. There's one group called Reconstructionist Judaism, and they believe that the 613 commandments of the Torah were the product of a religious evolutionary process, and that no Jew today is really bound literally to keep them, but we just kind of align ourselves with the spirit of, caring for the stranger, the widow, the orphan. So now you get a huge debate if you had a Reconstructionist and you had a ultra-Orthodox rabbi. You get a big debate back and forth about what it means to follow, to obey the Torah. But so that, again, that would be someone who's not anti-Semitic, but is anti-Judaic. And so we could apply the same principle. A Christian could critique Judaism as a religion without being opposed to the Jewish people per se. Does this make sense, everybody? I don't know if anyone wants to follow up on that. There are different Christian perspectives on Zionism. And as it happens, the guy who discipled me in college when I was in England, Stephen Sizer, he's probably one of the world's best-known Christian anti-Zionists. And my co-author of the Jonathan Edwards book, Gerald McDermott, is probably one of the world's best-known Christian Zionists. So I definitely have been exposed to both points of view. So we've noted that the tension here, though, is on the one hand the critique combined with Jesus saying to follow what they tell you to do. So in that sense, I think the overall verdict, I think it might be mixed in terms of is Jesus, he in some sense is affirming the role the Pharisees had on, but he's very critical of the example that they're setting. Yeah, Jeff.
Just a point. There are Hasidic Jews, or the Jews with the sideburns called the Payas, and they are anti-Zionist.
Yes.
They believe that the only one who can establish the state of Israel is the Messiah. So they are not Zionists. They do not support the state of Israel.
That's on page 4 here. No,
Is it?
It's,
Oh.
well, it's in the outline. I said
Sorry.
Well, no. That's, since I said that.
And in fact, just as I'll throw out a shout out for The Chosen, which is the story of written by Chaim Potok, who was story of a very Orthodox religious Jew and a Hasidic Jew, and they were like on opposing camps. They
the
were
Hasidic and the Orthodox.
They became friends, and it's a wonderful story. But it shows in that it's right around the creation of the state of Israel, and it's a wonderful book that shows you that contrast.
Yeah, I've been in the city of Jerusalem. I've walked through Mea Shearim, which is considered the ultra-Orthodox area. There are men. It's like California type weather, and men wearing fur hats. They would not make eye contact with me. I'm pretty obviously goy. I don't look very Jewish. Although I had people trying to give me literature, say, are you practicing? I said, no, I'm not on that team. But they, the irony is that the ultra-Orthodox, for the most part, live in the land of Israel without believing that Israel is a legitimate state. They see it as as a result of a secular bargain. And Theodor Herzl, the other early Zionists, they were secular Zionists. The religious Zionist who believes that God has given the land to the Jews and it is theirs by right. A secular Zionist is someone who's more pragmatic, is like, this is the land that the Jews lived in ancient times. The Jews need a homeland somewhere. Herzl at one point was thinking of possibly of Argentina. Can you imagine all the Jews in the world? Well, no, and ultimately, what's interesting is that it was Christian Zionists, many British and some American, convinced Herzl, the heartstrings of Jewish people throughout the world will be drawn to the land, the Holy Land. That has to be the place where a Jewish state is established. And there were people working to try to make that happen. But sadly, tragically, it was only the Jewish Holocaust in the 1940s that created the will among a number of international leaders for to support the establishment of a Jewish state. So let's talk. What is the critique here? Well, I'm on page 5 of the outline. The Pharisees, in Jesus' critique, have a this worldly and materialistic, externally focused kind of religion. How do we know that? I think the telling thing, he spent no less than 7 verses talking about the oath-taking, their oath-taking practices. Why is Jesus so preoccupied with the way that they swore oaths? Because of what it was actually communicating to people. Like to tell the people, if you swear by the altar, it doesn't matter, but if you swear by the gold on the altar, then it's a binding oath. And it's clear that this offended, this rankled Jesus. Because this was creating a kind of human-centered and materialistically centered view of religious practice. Or if you swear by, the altar, it doesn't matter. If you swear by the offering on the altar, the impression you get is that the Pharisees had great reverence for gold and the animals being sacrificed, not for the God to whom this was being offered. And this is why Jesus said, if you swear by the altar, you're swearing by swear by the temple, you're swearing by him who indwells the temple. And so Jesus wanted to instruct them so that they had a proper sense of spiritual priorities, a scale of values. Every offering took its significance from the altar from the temple from God himself. And they were not to reverse this. We were to put God at the top, then the temple, then the altar, then the offering. Their perspective, or upside-down perspective, the offering was the most important thing, followed by the altar, followed by the temple, followed by God. So this was a human-centered perspective, as if the most important thing was the human action at the center of it. And think about that for a second. How the church can slip into a human-centered picture, where the focus is, someone said, I guess a cynic about the American church said that the ABCs of the American church are attendance, buildings, and cash. well, if that's true, or if it's true at least in some measure, then there's the same problem of a materialistic and human-centered approach. So Jesus must oppose this in order to establish what true religion is, which begins from the inside. It begins with the one who is above all, and also with the human heart being rightly ordered toward God. Now, there's a shift that happens in the middle of the chapter, beginning in about verse 19, because he shifts from his instruction and regarding the swearing, the taking of oaths. And notice in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, "Take no oath at all." But here he's getting to even a core issue of what oath-taking really ought to be, and so it's a little bit different kind of approach in these verses. But from verse 19 on, he begins to talk about the hatred for, excuse me, not verse 19, that's a misprint. I guess it starts in 29? Yes, verse 29. He starts to talk about the persecution of the righteous. And this is the other side of the Phariseeism. And Jesus, it's this really interesting thing because it's almost like this panoramic view. He is seeing what is happening. And of course, he knows the hearts of those who even at this moment are plotting his death. He's taking time to attempt to bring a correction to those who are plotting his own death. Think about that for a second, because he knows what will soon take place. But he sees this moment, he connects those opposing him with earlier generations that had risen up against the prophets and had killed them. And he sees himself within this long line of succession. And some people struggle with this. It's like, is Jesus saying he's a prophet like the other prophets? Well, I think the answer is he is not less than a prophet. He's much more than that, but he's not less than that. He is one who faithfully speaks forth the word. He speaks truth to power, to use a kind of often political expression of like, that means speaking the truth, whether it's popular or not. This is what the Old Testament prophets did. Read in 1 Kings about Micaiah, who comes before Ahab, tells him that he won't return safely if he goes into this foolish battle against another king. And Ahab says, "Put this man in prison, feed him sparingly with bread and water." And he said, "If you return safely, the Lord has not spoken through me." And he was the only true prophet of God. There are all these other false prophets who were saying, "Go up and succeed, go up." And well, Ahab is killed. The arrow hits him at random, and he dies. But so Micaiah was willing to speak the thing that, and actually King Jehoshaphat is kind of an interesting character because he's often in the company of these wicked King Ahab, but he has his relationship with them, and unfortunately their families get intermarried, which is not a good thing. But Jehoshaphat, Ahab turns to Jehoshaphat and says, "I hate Micaiah because he always speaks evil of me. He doesn't tell me what I want to hear." So the prophet is someone who will always speak the word that the Lord has given to speak, whether it's popular or not, and Jesus fits the bill entirely to that. And so Jesus isn't lowering himself to the level of the prophets, he's rather elevating them by associating these prophets with himself. He mentions Abel as part of the righteous blood shed on verse 35, and then comes to Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. There's more than one Zechariah in the Old Testament. But this is one who was killed within the temple court, between the temple and the altar. But he says, you. He's speaking of this collective you. He's saying that the Pharisees are part of this larger collection of people, one generation after another, who has opposed the prophets of God. And then there's that. And then he breaks forth into his cry, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem," a plaintive cry. And there we go from the fierceness of his critique to the tenderness again. He compares himself to a mother hen that wants to gather the chicks and protect them. So again, there's love along with the fierce words of critique. We see earlier that the Pharisees had demonstrated that they did not welcome the prophets of God when they did not respond to John. And Jesus called them out on that. Tell me whether the baptism of John, remember that a couple chapters earlier, was from heaven or from man. They wouldn't answer that question. So they, in all likelihood, the Pharisees who didn't go out, didn't respond to John, would have been pleased when he was arrested. They wouldn't have been upset when he was beheaded. They had not responded to the one who had come as a prophet prior to Jesus, as the forerunner of Jesus. Now there's a final twist at the end of this chapter. And it's where he says, I say to you, pay close attention whenever Jesus says, I say to you. It's like accentuating his statement. I say to you, from now on, you shall not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Where have we encountered those words before? Sorry? Yeah, the triumphal entry. The triumphal entry. So Jesus is actually telling those to whom he's speaking that one day they too will cry Hosanna. So this is pointing to the eschaton, end times. This is not happening within their lifetime. But this is pointing forward. One day, just as the promise in Philippians 2, that every knee will bow, every tongue will confess Jesus as Lord. So he's saying, but you're not going to see me. I guess the Sanhedrin would have seen him, but this is I think is his last public appearance. Many of those, unless they went to the crucifixion, they may literally not have seen him again until the day when they would meet him again as the glorious returning Savior and conquer, which is not happening.
Would they have known that that's what he was referring to? Were they aware?
I think they would have been very puzzled. Yeah, that'll be the day that after he's said all this to them, yeah, I'm going to say blessed as he comes in the name of the Lord. But these are the words. These were the words of the triumphal entry. So it's a startling statement at the end. Jesus is anticipating his final vindication, even before those who opposed him, those who mocked him, who struck him, who tried him, who condemned him, who crucified him. Yeah. So I think we have touched on, well, just a little bit more on the critique. Yeah, sure.
Do you think this is also a statement for leaders to come in the future? Be careful what you do in leadership, especially if you have people underneath you, that there's a temptation. I mean, look at our politicians. They act like politicians. They, a true pastor acts differently. He tends to the sheep differently. He's honest. He cares for them. He's tender. There's mercy there, but he's also, wise. So I think it's a great lesson for the church about what not to do. Don't go after all the money, the prestige, the honor.
The outward mark, again, it's part of the externalized religion, externalized holiness. I think it's telling he doesn't critique them for sitting at the best place in the banquets. The people may have wanted to honor their teacher, to give him a special place to sit. He doesn't condemn, but look at what he says in verse 6. Not that they're wrong for sitting in the place of honor. He says they love, notice the word love, the place of honor at banquets. They love the chief seats in the synagogues. The word love is sort of implied. They love the respectful greetings. They reveled in that. That's what it was all about for them. It was all about these outward marks of respect, acknowledgement, esteem, honor. That's what drove them. At the end of the day, they actually didn't love God. And they didn't love the people. They loved themselves. Jesus said, if you would love me, if you would love my Father, if you acknowledge my Father, you would acknowledge and love me as well. That's more clear in the Gospel of John than here. But their distance from God preceded their response to Jesus. And so they didn't love God, but they loved these outward marks. And again, it was all outward. They didn't recognize this about themselves, most likely, almost certainly. I mean, a spiritually proud person who begins to recognize that he or she is spiritually proud is already halfway toward a healing and restoration process. And so I think it's this craving for recognition that really drove the Pharisees. And he mentions all the different kinds. It's the greeting. It's the place of honor. I'll let you think of what the contemporary translation of that would be in the church. The clicks online, the large mega church turnouts again. Now, this isn't saying that every person who has a large congregation is a Pharisee. And it is also not saying that there shouldn't be leaders. Jesus doesn't say that. But he said, the greatest among you, meaning there will be a greatest among you, but that will be the one who is serving everyone. So he's saying that's how you distinguish yourself as a leader, by serving everyone. There will be distinctions. This isn't a leveling process where we're all just folks and we show up Sunday morning, we don't know who's going to preach to us, you know. There actually are some congregations that do that. But the level of the preaching may be a reflection of not a lot of preparation, you know.
I want to ask my question again. Why are people so attracted, though, to this spiritual pride?
The spiritually proudful person?
Because it does seem that people are attracted to the Pharisees and to that, even now.
That, you know, this comes up in 2 Corinthians as well, when Paul makes this strange statement. He says you're drawn to anyone who strikes you, who insults you, who treats you badly. It's reverse psychology in a way, that if someone, I mean, there are people deeply looking for guidance in life. And if someone comes in, I've got the answer for you, you know, here's the way it is. Don't ask any questions. Just do it. I mean, there are a certain number of people that's what we do every Tuesday night, right? I just say, this is how it is. Yeah. No, there are people who are drawn to that. People in need of, and they're drawn to strength. Different cultures around the world respond different ways to that. Americans tend to be more disinclined. Chris, I'm not going to go there, but we have different styles of leadership within the U.S. and in different countries. And there's certain parts of the world where a leader is expected to be very strong and not to show weakness, not to show uncertainty or doubtfulness about what he or she is saying or doing. Okay, let's turn to Christian Phariseeism. And on page 10 of the outline, we cannot conclude that the problem of Phariseeism ended in the first century, or the problem of self-righteousness, or the problem of spiritual pride. What a Christian Pharisee does is takes God's precious gifts, Christ, forgiveness, salvation, could be biblical doctrine, the community of faith, prayer, and then uses these, leverages them for personal, human, fleshly desires and agendas. Now, just think for a second what throughout the Gospel of Matthew Jesus has said about some of the leaders, the religious leaders. Top of page 11. Prayer, this is a Sermon on the Mount. Prayer was not a means of humble communion with God. It was an opportunity to show off and impress other people. Remember he talked about the people who would pray and standing on the street corners? Finding the busiest intersection in Jerusalem. And of course, they would typically pray with their hands extended. Imagine everyone having to walk around this person. I mean, my favorite there is the almsgiving. He says, do not sound a trumpet before you when you give alms. Was Jesus being literal? I don't think it's metaphorical. I think there actually were people who imagine you had a personal trumpeter next to you, you're a rich person and your trumpeter's walking along, and then there's a beggar there, and he says, wait, he says, could you give me some money, sir? He says, just a second. Da 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 da. So the trumpet blasts, and then yeah, selfie, yeah, the big checks on the telethon, yeah, the giant checks that are 10 feet across. So again, it was an opportunity to show off, to impress other people. And what Jesus says is, if you're doing this for human recognition, he says, you've received your reward in full. You want human recognition, you've got it, but he's saying this doesn't impress God. He says, when you're praying, go into your inner room. Now, there's a place for public prayer meeting with other believers, but not as a way to display your piety, your devotion to God before other people. It says, go into the inner room when you shut your door. Pray to your Father in secret. Your Father who sees in secret will repay you. There are people, when they were fasting, wanted to make sure that other people knew they were fasting. And I guess today that would be like in some churches where there's fasting. Well, are you okay? Yeah. Just on the fourth day of my 20-day fast now, or I'm on day 19. It's like, yeah, making sure that other people. He says, you're not to act in that way. Jesus said. For the Pharisees, the gracious election of God, choice of Abraham and his offspring, was turned into a badge of superiority. There was actually a ancient prayer attributed to the early rabbis. I thank you, Lord, that you have not made me a Gentile, a dog, or a woman. And I know what you're thinking. They were anti-dog, That was just kidding. No, can you imagine that? And actually, Jesus touches on it. Remember the Pharisee and the publican at the temple, and the Pharisee says, Lord, I thank you that I am not like other men. And then he launches into his recitation before God of his own righteousness. I pay tithes of everything I get. I fast twice a week. And he even says, oh, Lord, I thank you I'm not like that, tax gatherer over there. And then Jesus completely inverts everyone's expectation, tells him the tax gatherer is the one who went home righteous and a right relationship with God rather than the Pharisee. So if we skip this to Christian Phariseeism, many of these same points apply. Prayer could be a way of showing off. I mean, do you ever find that you use a certain prayer voice? Oh, Lord, when you're praying. Or crying, we can cry out in such a way as, oh, wow, that person really has a heart, when they're praying. There are other things that we can do and pray. If we're thinking about how our prayer sounds to the people around us, and we're not thinking about what it means before God, it doesn't have to sound a certain way. It doesn't have to sound impressive. It doesn't have to be eloquent, or it doesn't have to be incredibly passionate, high volume, plaintive. The Lord will hear it either way, even if it's a whispered prayer. Financial giving in the Christian church is to be a means of helping, strengthening the ministry, helping other people. It's not to be, an opportunity to show off. Fasting is not to be a way of demonstrating your own high level of devotion to God. And there's a kind of praying for people in need that can slip into Christian Phariseeism. I mean, it could start with someone who's never had trouble with drug addiction that says, Lord, I pray tonight for the drug addicts, And Lord, God, we pray that you would be with them. And Lord, give them the wisdom, give them the insight that they need to understand how they need to change their life. And see, the longer I pray in that vein, the more I'm setting myself above the other group, right? You like that? I told you I'm a recovering Pharisee. And the worst of all is like sharing their prayer requests. Do you know about Wilfred? Oh man, Wilfred. And then it's like, I don't know if I should tell you about Wilfred. What he's gone through. I said, well, go ahead. Yeah, tell me about it. Okay, but it's a prayer request. Okay, and then it's gossip, right? But it's disguised as a prayer request. So, for a Christian Pharisee, in the Christian Pharisee's heart of hearts, this person really has a trouble with salvation by grace. And that could mean that someone who seems, outwardly be radically alienated from the Christian community, who suddenly shows up, has had a life-changing encounter with Jesus, the Christian Pharisee can start to feel like the older brother. When the prodigal son came back and there's a big party being thrown for the one who was dead, who's now alive, as the father said. So Christian Pharisee can struggle with that. And I think all of us can be younger brothers or older brothers, depending on the people around us. If you put us around people who are super holy and committed to God, then we think, hey, give me some grace, I made some mistakes in my life, but don't hold that against me. And then you put us around the people who are really messing up in their life. Then we suddenly start to become like the older brother, like, man, get your act together. So it depends on who's around us and we really shouldn't be comparing ourselves to other people. We should be looking to the Lord, letting him guide us. But if we're comparing ourselves to other people, we can easily fall into that trap. The desire for outward marks of honor and deference. And then also just a belief that one's own talent and diligence has raised one above other people, and that the respect that one gets, that this is kind of due to one as a Christian leader. That's another way in which Christian leaders can move in the direction of becoming Pharisaical. Have I left something out?
We can be rules about our devotion time and our amount of Bible reading and what we do on Sunday or not, and whether we dance or go to certain kinds of movies or something, and drinking and all kinds of rules. I went to a Bible college in South Carolina that was not the only Bible college at that time that had zillions of rules, but we had them. And it was a binding thing, especially the Sunday part. We weren't allowed to go to dinner on Sunday unless you were on a long distance and you needed food. But just to go to dinner after church, that was wrong. And movies and dancing and theater too. That was amazing, because there was another very strict school 100 miles away that had theater courses, and we said, how can they do that? They have so many rules. So even after I left the school and went on to be working overseas, that Sunday idea was really strong. It took me a long time to change it and break it somewhat and realize that it was a sort of a Phariseeism, that I'm better because I don't work on Sunday, I don't take care of the yard on Sunday, I don't fix my car on Sunday, like, why not? Or other jobs on Sunday even. And it took me a long time to break that, and not to look down on someone that was free of it. So there I was a Pharisee, and I had to recover. I'd like to hear your story too on that. Yeah.
Well, I think there are certain things that are perfectly clear in God's word about, we're not to steal, not to lie, not to commit adultery. Then there is a wide range of a realm of freedom where we make choices. And Romans 14 addresses that, and talking about let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. And it says one man regards one day above another regard every day alike. Well, what's that talking about? Well, it almost certainly is talking about Sabbath. It says let each one be fully convinced in his own mind. And that would apply to, if you feel pangs of conscience because of what you've watched on your Netflix channel, then, it's not my part to intervene in your life and tell you shouldn't be watching such and such, but you should be responding to the Holy Spirit in your life, where there's an open question about how to do that. And it's one thing, the reason it's important not to look down on others who have stricter rules is like, I remember a story about a man who would go to no films at all, called it the cinema, emphasized the word sin, which is probably Now, the story is set back in the 1950s, so this is the Leave It to Beaver era, so I don't even know what this person would say about today. But the point is that if someone wants to follow a strict principle like that, I am not to look down on that. That's the other thing, that I'm not to look down on a person like that. He may, before the Lord, have been made a commitment to acting according to certain strict principles. But if that same person turns around and says, all of you are sinning if you turn on a television set or if you watch a movie, then that's another matter. So what I decide myself is different from. I heard a story once of a man who used to be, in his days before he was converted to Christ, he would go to baseball games and he would get drunk and shout obscenities and so on. And after his conversion, he couldn't go to baseball games because he found himself slipping into the same pattern of behavior. So he wisely refrained from that. So far be it from me to say that that wasn't the right decision, for him to make in that situation. So in these matters of conscience, we need to really be responding to the Lord and how he would direct and guide us. Okay, so let's just, in conclusion, talk a little bit about this idea of spiritual deception and spiritual pride. If someone doesn't understand their own spiritually prideful attitude, how does a person get correction? Well, there needs to be a feedback loop and something like that. And to use kind of silly example in the notes, I talk about a young man, I call him William, who watches NBA games, and he watches LeBron James and what he does, and he thinks, oh, I could do that. That's no problem with it. I've watched it 100 times. I'll just go on the court. Well, then there's a neighborhood basketball game, and he gets invited in, and he finds that his skills are not only not those of LeBron James, they're far below the level of the average basketball player within his own neighborhood. So there's a feedback loop. He suddenly is corrected by reality. But there's a peculiar dynamic with spiritual pride. So let's refer to a certain young woman. Let's say she's a high school student named Rebecca, and her former friends in middle school have taken a different path in life than Rebecca has. Her female friends have lost their virginity with their high school boyfriends, or even with young men they met at a party. They're all into alcohol and drugs. And in reaction to this, Rebecca keeps herself aloof. She doubles down on her church attendance and Bible study. And sometimes she prays for them. Lord, let them see the light. In Jesus' name, amen. But without realizing it, Rebecca may be starting to think of herself as more devoted, more committed than just the average run-of-the-mill Christian that she sits next to on Sunday mornings. And so in her prayer life, she may be starting to pray things, in her inner thoughts of, Lord, I thank you for giving me such a strong spirit of devotion to yourself. And so a friend of Rebecca's, let's call her Susan, who's a mature believer, she takes Rebecca aside and admonishes her and says, I think, Susan, maybe you're holding yourself a little bit aloof from other people. So how do you think Susan will react? Okay, why wouldn't she react well? Or what would go through Susan's mind through Rebecca's mind when Susan speaks to her? Can you picture that situation? She's gently, but clearly. You mean Rebecca's following the word? Okay, she's obeying the word. Now, if Rebecca really knows her Bible, she will know this says in Proverbs, rebuke a wise person and he will love you. Rebuke a scoffer. Do not reprove a scoffer lest he hates you. But you could see the attitude of Rebecca as becoming, I got the words turned around, the names turned around. Okay, so I appreciate Susan in many ways, but the reason she's criticizing me is because she's jealous of my spiritual insights. She just can't handle the depth of the wisdom that the Lord has placed in his holy word and revealed to me, to the Bible study. So I think I'm going to have to leave this Bible study and go to another one where I'm more appreciated and where the people are more spiritual. So you see, the problem with the spiritually proud person is that they often will interpret a critique as a sign that you are unspiritual. And so the feedback loop doesn't work, and so they can become more and more entrenched within their own sense of their spiritual superiority. It's not like playing basketball where you can go out on the court and you figure out pretty quickly what your skills are. This is a very hidden inward thoughts of the heart that can really alienate people from God, particularly as it develops further. And you going to comment, Jeff? No. So Jonathan Edwards, the great theologian in American history, considered often the greatest, he commented on the time of spiritual fervor, the 1740s, known as the Great Awakening. And I'm just going to read you what Edwards said because it's so penetrating. What was happening in that time is that there was criticism and disagreement between the so-called new lights and the old lights. The people who were part of the revival thought this is just the greatest thing. I mean, some people said the greatest thing since the days of the apostles because large numbers of people were being converted. Now, there were some extremes. I mean, there was a story of when George Whitefield came. You know, the greatest actor in London said of Whitefield, says, "This man makes the multitudes weep with the way he pronounces the word Mesopotamia." And the story was that Whitefield could preach to 15,000 people at one time with no amplification. Ben Franklin, our founding father in America, read this in the London papers, didn't believe it. But then Whitefield came to Philadelphia, and Franklin estimated the crowd size that there were 15,000 people leading to Whitefield on both sides of the Delaware River. If you know anything about Philadelphia, that's like, how is that even possible? How is it even? So anyway, we had these amazing preachers. When Whitefield came to Boston Commons, one of the critics of the revival said, the people fell and brayed on the ground like cattle. I mean, there were people who were so overcome spiritually that they fell down and they made sounds. And so there was this split between those who were celebrating the revival and those who were attacking it. And this is what Edwards wrote. He said, "The first and the worst cause of errors that prevail in such a state of things is spiritual pride." Okay, now listen to this. "This is the main door by which the devil comes into the hearts of those that are zealous for the advancement of religion. 'Tis the chief inlet of smoke from the bottomless pit to darken the mind and mislead the judgment. This is the main handle by which the devil has hold of religious persons and the chief source of all the mischief that he introduces to clog and hinder a work of God." In other words, the devil foments, he is himself supremely proud, and so he encourages the spirit of pride in devoted people so that it interferes with the work that God is doing. "This cause of error is the mainspring, or at least the main support of all the rest. 'Tis till this disease is cured, medicines are in vain applied to heal other diseases." That was what I was trying to get at with the story of Rebecca and Susan, is that she's not receiving correction. "'Tis by this that the mind defends itself in other errors and guards itself against light by which it might be corrected and reclaimed. The spiritually proud man is full of light already. He doesn't need instruction. He's ready to despise the offer of it. But if this disease is be healed, all other things will be rectified, easily rectified. The humble person," this is a positive point, "is like a little child. He easily receives instruction. He's jealous over himself. He's sensible how liable he is to go astray. And therefore, if it be suggested to him that he does so, he's ready most narrowly and impartially to inquire. Nothing sets a person so much out of the devil's reach as humility. And so it prepares the mind for true divine light without darkness, and it clears the eye to look on things as they truly are." Okay, that's 18th century prose. I hope you're able to get the gist of that. So Edwards is saying that, that he talks about that spiritual pride is a deadly, deadly thing. And whereas humility, it's, if you have to talk to someone about a problem, it's such a pleasure to speak to a humble person who is listening intently to tell me what you see. Tell me where was I wrong? Someone who has that attitude. Whereas, gosh, you would shrink from wanting to talk to a proud person, anticipating anger, red face, accusations against you, how dare you. So we have, in church history, we have this splits, particularly when they're movements of the Spirit. In fact, you could even apply Edwards' categories to the life of Jesus. You could say, in effect, Jesus was a new light teacher because he's bringing new light, new revelation. And those who were the old lights, they thought they already had it together. And think of, I mentioned this before, but think there was 1,000 years between the time of Solomon's temple and the time the Pharisees were standing listening to Jesus speak. 1,000 years. That's a long tradition. And like, how dare you, Rabbi Jesus, to question us? We're the people who have demonstrated our loyalty to Yahweh, to the God of Israel, and to the Torah, faithfulness, the temple. How dare you, Jesus? So, old light, new light. And I expect, honestly, if revival, we have a major revival in our lifetime, we could expect that there will be controversy because this has always happened before. And I could go on in great depth about that, having worked on an encyclopedia on this topic, but yeah.
Well, there's a story that I think is apropos. There was during Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and there were 3 eminent rabbis who were sitting in the front row. And the first one gets up and he goes and he gets to the altar and he falls on his face and he cries out, "God, I am nothing, I am nothing." Beats his chest, goes, he sits down. Next, the second one gets up and he too cries out, "God, I am nothing, I am nothing." Goes, he sits down. Then the third one goes up and he too falls down and he goes, "Oh God, I am nothing, I am nothing." And the two that are sitting down, one looks at the other and goes and says, "Look who thinks he's nothing."
That's good, yeah. Well, that's what you call ostentatious humility. It's a humility that proclaims itself. And actually, I don't often quote Nietzsche in a Bible study, but Nietzsche, the philosopher, said, there is no pride like the pride of the man who is proud of his own humility. Think about that for a second. Being proud of your own humility. That's the twisted, tangled character, and it really takes the physician of souls, Jesus, to use his scalpel to kind of cut and to reveal what lies within. So if this is a really dangerous threat to us spiritually, then, first of all, we should recognize that other people are more likely to perceive if we're slipping into spiritual pride than we will. And we need to be open to criticism and correction. In fact, I even suggest maybe a periodic doctor checkup, with a trusted friend. How am I doing? Because there's so many ministries, churches that have been ruined. And if you get to the core of that, you think, well, so-and-so acted out and say, yeah, but there may very well, I'd say either 8 cases out of 10, 9 cases out of 10, there was often undiagnosed and untreated spiritual pride that preceded that. The book of Proverbs says that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before stumbling. So very often when there's pride in the leaders, in the congregation, then people are not aware of their own vulnerability. And that's when you have these catastrophic collapses, and then there's a scandal, and there's some people who act in a way that's clearly against Scripture, yeah.
Do you think there's a close relationship between spiritual pride and ministers and people within the church who end up falling as far as having sexual affairs and stealing from the church and things like that? Do you see the two of them very closely related?
Well, the mindset of the proud person is that, to put it real bluntly, is that the rules are for the little people. I'm so important that I can do things that ordinary folk can't. And it's okay, because I'm at the center of some very important ministry, organization. And this is not just in the church, this is in the political sphere too. It's interesting. My father was, he almost became head of Enron. He was a competitor for Ken Lay, who became head. And this was the largest corporate bankruptcy in U.S. history up to that point in the year 2000. So he had 15,000 people working under him. My father did. I'm very proud of him, and one person over him. But the thing that he found when InterNorth was acquired by Houston Natural Gas, became Enron, became a different corporation, there was this hubris that came in. Actually, there's a documentary called Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room. They started to think they could do anything, that they were not just a gas or pipeline company, and so they got involved in all kinds of speculative deals. They were going to do video on demand. They lost something like $15 to $20 billion. They knew nothing. They hadn't even put in the fiber optic cables like 25 years ago, but they were putting all this money into it. So there was this hubris, this arrogance about themselves. And what my father noted, again, he wasn't in the corporation. Well, he was a CEO of a smaller company that was a subsidiary that was sold off. But is that the very same guys that were involved in some of these shady business dealings, they were having affairs with their secretary. It was like some of them were embezzling, they were taking money out. And so it's kind of several different things were breaking down at the same time. But they thought of themselves as set apart and that they could get away with this. And of course, ultimately what happened is they had two sets of books, one that was official and the one that they created a limited partnership, and then that limited partnership took all the losses, the financial losses, so it wasn't. And I remember reading Time Magazine, they were praising Enron and what an amazing company it was, and then when it collapsed, it totally collapsed. And then when the stock was started to decline in value, and the leaders, the top dozen or so executives, realized that they were going to lose all of the stock, they said they were adding a new administrator to the stock, and so they didn't allow any of the employees to sell their stock, but they sold all of their stock. So they took a golden parachute out. This would be like the captain of the ship getting into the only lifeboat and letting everyone else sink down. And my father knew people that put all of their money, because the executives were saying, put all your money into Enron stock. Enron's going to keep rising up forever. So hubris, pride, is connected with usually with a moral breakdown. And the proud person, usually there are signs along the way, but the proud person is stubborn, resistant, and he's called, the book of Proverbs calls him a fool. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man is he who listens to counsel.
I could add one more point. Would you compare spiritual pride with idol worship, the idol being yourself?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that would be reasonable. Well, we should turn to our meditation, thinking about ourselves and what we can learn from this. think we should record if you would move the chairs now. So we record all of your, oh, you're not going to sit? Sure. Oh, no, you're going to sit. Oh, she just didn't know. You're going to sit, sit over, you don't have to speak, we don't want you to. No, don't have to, but we encourage you to. Yeah, just, you don't have to.
Okay, group over there, let's go. Men of water from the rock, thou speaketh too long. I'm not trying to be too eloquent. Watch what Mike's doing. Mike is going to crack up. Okay, well, I'm not going to be too eloquent here because God sees my heart. But I was reading this chapter, and I was wondering, well, why would Jesus say all these things, knowing that the Pharisees were ultimately probably not going to, he wasn't going to convert one, didn't say that he did, and also that some of these men could be responsible for putting him to death. But I thought to myself, well, millions and millions of future believers would be reading this. And that's why it was written down by the apostles. And what's the message here? The message is be careful about spiritual pride. It's insidious. It's so insidious that sometimes you don't even know it's in you. And I was actually, as Mike was, speaking, I was like, man, is that me? I kept thinking, gosh, have I done that? And it's like, yes, I have done that. Yes. And so I also noticed real quickly, I was talking to the group about all the woes. So there's verse 14, woe to you, scribes. 15, woe to you. 16, woe to you. And then it talks about, there's more woes in verse 23, 25. Anyway, Mike said there's 8 woes. And he's pretty harsh. He calls them blind men. He says they're sons of hell, hypocrites, and murderers. It's about as tough a chapter as I've seen at all. So the message here is, and I think the message is this. It's in verse 12. Well, there's a lot of messages, but one of them is, whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted.
Amen. Yeah. The way I saw it is like the way the word says, you will have eyes and you won't see, or ears and you won't hear, because Jesus talked to them the whole chapter, and yet they ended up crucifying him, the readers. So as Andrew is saying, it's for us to do that self-check and, to see where we have fallen off. Because when we are believing, we start the journey so with trembling, and fearful. But as we stay in the Christian walk, we start drifting, relaxing on things, or feeling like we don't have that zeal which we started off with. So it's for us to do a self-examination and see where have we fallen off the rail and go back to our own journey.
For me, it was an invitation to examine myself on where I am in my development of love for God. You know, how much of it do I love myself? How much of it do I love Him and want Him lifted up and want truth in my own heart? With the understanding that the more truth that I welcome, the more freedom I have, because the more of His grace can enter my heart.
And for me, I've learned about the Pharisees who are misusing their level of knowledge of law to take the advantages of innocent people who are ready to believe anything that they are taught, as long as they are taught by the Pharisees, because they were law keepers. And the Pharisees were the most respected people at that time, and nobody was allowed to challenge them. And here, Jesus Christ has already started to challenge them with their own doings. And I would say that the Pharisees were misusing their authority or their position. And also they acted superior. I think they were not mixing with the other congregations of that church of those days.
I thought it was interesting that they stopped asking Jesus questions when he stumped them. Because I feel like if someone stumped me, I'd be like, I want to know more. You know, like it would just seem like they could be really fascinated by him. And I just realized that, you know, they missed Jesus. They didn't understand. I mean, and it's so sad because their whole life was about following the law and following it well. And yet, what was the law preparing them, you know, what was the function of it was to, you know, have relationship with God, and they missed it when God was standing right in front of them. And so I guess what my thought was that we really, speaking to me, you know, having a heart stance of listening, like of like receiving. I think a lot of where this comes into play is when we kind of do a lot of doing rather than seeking and listening and responding and resting in the Lord. I think our world is pretty busy and wants us to move fast. And often that leads us to live outside our bandwidth. And that's often when we get into pride, I think. So, yeah, rest in the Lord.
I'm going to key on one of Mike's notes here. I'm abbreviating it a little bit. A Christian Pharisee takes God's precious gifts and then twists and distorts these gifts to make them serve his or own personal human fleshly desires and agendas. When I read that in this whole chapter, it immediately reminded me of a sermon that I listened to recently, given by Peter Gomes, who was the head of the divinity school at Harvard University, and he gave a sermon that he called The Lively Oracles of God. And he was referring to the scriptures. And he was saying that how you should use the scriptures in your daily lives. And I'm abbreviating his long sermon and his excellent orator skills. He says, don't worship it. He says, don't use it as a club to defeat your enemies. He says that the scriptures are intended to be, and he quotes Psalms 119, a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. He says it's not a spotlight. It's not going to show you everything, and it's not an atlas. It's not going to take you directly from point A or B. But if you allow it to, it will get you where you need to go. And that was the point of the sermon. And that's what I got from it.
I got a couple things from this chapter. Having attended a church where they use scripture to kind of beat you over the head with it, I try to be very careful the way that I judge others. And if I pray for them, if I see something in them that I feel I need to pray for, I ask God to help me examine myself before I start, praying for them, because I think sometimes when we have the same sin in us, we recognize it in others. So that's one thing I do. But also, I thought another thing I got out of this chapter that I thought was very interesting. In verse 29, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets." But here, they're right there with Jesus, and Jesus is speaking to them, knowing what's going to happen. And then also, too, we can look at the apostles and the people that were living, and experienced being with Jesus and thinking, wow, they didn't have enough faith, they should have known better because Jesus was right there. And, we can judge them, too. Thinking if we were there, we wouldn't have done that. So I thought that was interesting.
Okay. So here we see Jesus talking to his disciples and the multitude. So in the multitude, I would assume the Pharisees were there too. Then he gives recognition that they're important people. Listen to them, but don't do what they are. Listen to them, but don't do as they do. So Jesus is trying to provoke that reaction from the people, that they are teaching you to obey God. But in the same thing, in the same way, they are not practicing what they are saying. So I think Jesus was going back to his commandment: love one another, have mercy, have kindness, because these are the things that are not practiced by these teachers of law. So he's pointing out that this is what you need to do.
At the end of the text on page 14, Mike has a line, if each one of us is becoming spiritually proud, I don't know if you can become, we're already there, then the chances are that other people will detect this in us before we perceive it in ourselves. Each of us, therefore, must remain open to criticism from others. So what is that doctor checkup that we need from a friend? Well, it has to be a friend. We talked about how the trust that had to be developed to be able to do that with one another. I can't confess my deep sins to a whole group like this. It wouldn't be appropriate. And I need that trust that it wouldn't be rumored around. So we have to keep letting others examine us. I thought that's hard, to be open to criticism and open to correction, but it really does cauterize the wounds and clean out the sin. Sometimes just one confession of something you've dealt with for a long time, months or years even, just confessing it openly just blasts it away somehow. I don't know how the psychologists would talk about that, but we have to be also aware of our spiritual pride. I'm more and more aware of that as time goes on, and I think, oh my, how often it jumps on me. I was in church a week or so ago, and the pastor hadn't even talked to him yet. He asked me to pray during the communion part of the message of the service, to pray for the bread or the wine, one of them. Oh boy, my pride surged real fast. Wow, yeah, he's calling on me. What? I managed to come out with a prayer. But it's just so easy to fall into that trap or well. I think it's like a well. You're just always down there. Seeking God, asking Him to reveal that weakness and to clarify, yes, there are things that have changed and how God has done good things and work in us and given us gifts and strengths. You can't just down yourself the whole time. There are good things, but realize there's still a lot of that cesspool there.
What I see in this is it's so easy to look and say, look at them. But I realize that I could be the exact same way. And I think the answer to it, one of the things is confidants, close friends, people that you can be honest with, a partner you can be with, and you have a relationship that say, I want you to tell me. If you see something, tell me. I want you to tell me. Because if you think I know I haven't arrived. I know there's a lot of, because we all have blind spots. The hardest person to see is yourself, how you are. But if you have a true friend, somebody that knows you, that you have a relationship, they see things and you can discuss and talk, and there's a given, and in fact, that's, I think that's the key. And I look at that and I go, Lord, help me. And I don't want to be like that.
Good evening. We should be God pleasers and not people pleasers. The Pharisees got their reward already because they were getting their attention from people. And I don't even believe there are sermons who are really geared towards helping people towards God. But it was just to show their prowess and to attract a lot of attention. And we should avoid doing that. And just like my brother on my left just said right now, we should accept ourselves. And one of the ways you can do that is have a confidant. And when we raise that in our group, I mentioned that somebody might, especially ladies, dress up and feel they really look pretty. They're the best in the city until they go to a mirror and then realize, they haven't done their hair correctly. So this other person is going to see you better. And I would request Professor to consider the topic of judging others next time. Thank you.